sort of slightly edited from my own science code. Look at the one on the top and look at the one on the bottom and look at which one you think is sort of easier to parse by just looking at it for a little while. I presume most of you will conclude the bottom. The top one looks like it was sort of randomly, I type buttons on the keyboard, which is sometimes how it feels, but the point is there's the one on the top has made a whole bunch of gross violations of the PEP8 style guidelines, and the bottom one, I did everything I could to sort of follow the guidelines. This is important both because it helps you and future you, but it also helps other people read their code, right? And this is sort of one of the most important things about using a style guide that's shared across Python, is that you can actually look at code that's sort of PEP8 formatted, and you can often sort of figure out what's going on with it, even if you don't understand at all what the intent of the code is, because the sort of hints from looking at how this is capitalized and how that one is not capitalized tell you something about what that code is actually, what is actually happening with that code. So with just following a few conventions, you can look at a piece of code and immediately understand what's going on once you've done this for a while. I would also add it's just good for people like me who have a sort of pathological need for things to be internally and externally consistent. So if you want to make me happy, follow the guidelines. But there's a great quote from the top of PEP8, which so PEP8 was written by Guido van Rossum, the guy who wrote Python. It's actually originally from Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds," which I really love because it's just a good quote in general, especially for me. But it's also very important to keep in mind when thinking about any style guidelines, because you really shouldn't take any of them as rules, right? Many of them, there are good reasons to violate every once in a while because you have a specific reason to. It's just when you're like, well, I could do either of these things, pick the one that matches the style guideline. So that's sort of my overview of what's going on with style. So now let me give you a quick description of the sort of what I think are the most important parts of PEP8, which is the canonical style guide for Python, which I think is also basically followed by every major Python project that I'm aware of, although they all have their own little quirks and changes. All right, so the first thing is easy. Indentation, indentation in Python can be tabs or sort of arbitrary numbers of spaces. The convention is always use 4 spaces. That's easy. You can set most editors to just follow that rule, and you're done. Now there's naming conventions, which we talked a little about a couple days ago. The first one is pretty simple, right? Don't use, single letter variable names unless you really have a reason to. So people often violate this with like I and J when you're iterating over things, but that's like the only exception you should allow yourself to make. The other one is this sort of naming convention for what kind of capitalization you use and how you delimit, how you describe spaces. The camel case one that we saw before is essentially always used for class names, so an object-oriented programming context. And this snake case, as Cameron was calling it, is primarily to be used for most other things, right? Like package names, module names, function names, method names. There's also sort of a little bit of debate in this because it's not very specific, but this sort of convention of don't worry about spaces at all is often used to denote individual variables as distinct from the snake case. Although that's not in PEP8, that's just a sort of rule of thumb that I think people have sort of organically developed. Another piece of naming conventions that I found really useful to remember is that occasionally you want to have a variable name like if or is. That won't work because those are reserved keywords in Python, but it does say in PEP8 the solution to that is straightforward. You just add an underscore at the end, and then you can use that if it makes sense for your code. There's a lot more in PEP8 about these naming conventions. In fact, half the length of PEP8 is just describing different naming conventions and different opinions about how they should be. Cool. All right, so that's the naming conventions. So the point is you can go back and look at that if you're particularly interested, which you probably aren't. But if you're building a large package, it might be wise to just try to keep your eyes from bleeding while you look at it. All right, another important thing that's useful for the kind of code we might write is the sort of spacing, the places you're expected to put spaces. So one of the most important ones is when you're calling a function, you should put spaces after the comma. That white space really spreads things out and makes it a little bit more readable what's going on. And at the same time, you often want to put those spaces around operations, right? So for the same purpose, you should use C space equals space, an expression, and not jam it all together, because the white space really helps with that. There are a couple exceptions to these rules. The one that's officially listed in PEP8 is that when you define function defaults, when you're defining a function, or similarly, if you're giving these as like a equals 1, b equals 2, then you don't put spaces there because it's sort of one construct. And then there's a more informal exception. Something went wrong there, but let's not worry about that. That when you're using asterisk, right, to represent multiplication or division, you don't put spaces around that purely because that's how we write it out when we're writing out math equations, right? There's spaces around pluses, and there's not spaces when you just do y equals mx plus b. Now imports, I'm sure you're using all the time. The PEP8 convention is they should always be at the top. There are some technical reasons why you might not always want to do that, but unless you know why, you should just always put your imports at the top. They should also be spaced out so you can see them, right? Don't jam all your imports in one line, instead do them separately. The official rule in PEP8 is that the standard library should always be at the top, right? You import OS and sys, and then NumPy is below that. Although I should say there's a fairly common style that is basically you just take the shortest ones and put those at the top and work your way down. Again, I think that's because coders tend to be really twitchy people. Right. Oh yeah, another convention for naming that's important that actually has real meaning is this underscore thing. So we talked about this a couple days ago, but any variable that has a leading underscore is usually implied to be the person writing the code doesn't want anyone else to access it. It's got some special meaning or hidden away somehow for some reason. So usually if you see something with a leading underscore, you shouldn't mess around with it unless you really know what you're doing. And then double underscore means really, really don't touch it unless you really, really know what you're doing. And in fact, that has some effect that's not worth dwelling on right now, but it actually is used in the language to denote some special things. Now comments, right? So there's a simple rule about comments that if you are going to put in inline comments, there should be at least 2 spaces between the code and the comment symbol, and then 1 space after. That again, this is all just sort of to improve readability. But in general, you shouldn't use comments unless you have you're trying to indicate a specific thing about that point in the code. Whenever possible, you should use doc strings to convey the information you might otherwise think to put in a comment. And then there's a whole separate PEP I won't talk about how doc string should work. So you can read that if you're so interested. I also like this quote from the description of comments, mostly because it's interesting and has some sort of food for thought about colonialism, perhaps. But more importantly is that it says, if you're not from an English-speaking, if you're not a native English speaker, basically write your comments in English unless you are 120% sure that your code will never be read by people who don't speak your language. So essentially the official language of Python is English, whether you like it or not. Then the last guideline I want to talk about is this one about line lengths. So lines are not supposed to be any longer than 79 characters. But I should say this is usually the most controversial guideline, because the whole reason why it says 79 is because Fortran could only do 80 characters and terminals are only 80 characters wide. And that's not necessarily a good reason to make your code. Depending on editors, that's not always true. But this is the official guideline you're supposed to follow. And the way you can, if you care about this stuff, the way you can take care of this is essentially use the fact that inside Python, or in Python, if you're inside a parentheses, you can insert a line break, and it acts as though it's the same line. So like this, you see these 3 things, these 3 arguments of the function are inside parentheses, so you can write it like this. And in fact, those are the exact same piece of Python code. They will operate exactly the same way. So you can use that to take a very long expression and split it up by just breaking inside parentheses.